The latest version of the report, Keeping Track of New York City's Children, was released about 3 weeks ago. The findings show a bleak picture of how slow progress can be in one of the world's wealthiest cities, and while not exactly shocking, they are still shameful. For example, 38.9% of Latino children live in poverty, and 32.5% of Black children. Now, Latino and Black youth have the lowest graduation rates and the highest dropout rates, and statistics on infant mortality show that a Black baby is more than 3 times as likely to die before his first birthday than a white baby.
It's very powerful. To give us a more detailed explanation of the findings and why these two groups have shown so little improvement over the years and what solutions could be effective, we want to welcome the author of the report, Courtney Wolf, Senior Policy Associate for Research and Data Analysis at Citizens Committee for Children. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Yolanda McBride, Director of Public Policy at the Children's Aid Society. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So we welcome you both. And for those who have not read the report, who are not aware of it, what do you think would be, give us an overview of it and tell us what the most unexpected finding was?
Sure. Well, you scooped a lot of my statistics there from the get-go, but that's okay. You know, it's a big report. Yeah. It includes hundreds of indicators that sort of describe the well-being of children in New York City. Some of the statistics that we talk about all the time at Citizens Committee for Children, 30% of children citywide, that's 1 in 3 children, live in poverty. Close to 24,000 children sleep in the city's shelters each night. Wow. Last school year, only about a third of children were meeting Common Core standards in reading and math.
Only 1/3 were meeting.
1/3.
Wow.
Elementary and middle school children. I guess on a brighter note, you know, a city of 1.8 million children, more than 96% of children have health insurance coverage, so that's a very good thing. One thing the report does, besides just looking at that citywide picture, is we actually look at data, drill down to the community level, and we also, as you mentioned, look at different demographic groups, most specifically racial and ethnic groups. And that's really where the telling statistics are, because you can talk about this great big city of 1.8 million children, but the fact of the matter is life is going to be very different for a child in somewhere like Brownsville, Brooklyn, as compared to a child in maybe the Upper East Side or Greenwich Village.
So this report is instructive to say the least, but talking to both of you, how would you want someone to move forward using this? Because there's, I'm sure, some voices who would be, oh wow, it's more news that makes Black and brown people want to jump out of the window, but how can we make this instructive and to build from it?
Well, from an organization that provides services to the children and families that are being talked about in the report, I think it's very instructive for us to really understand the population that we're serving. So we are currently doing a lot of work in terms of providing programs and services in the communities of need that are being talked about in the Keeping Track report. And so for us, it's helpful. Any information that we have that solidifies that the kind of work that we currently are doing is the right kind of work that we should be doing in those communities is always helpful. In addition to, I think for policymakers, I think it's insightful for them in terms of what's going on in the communities and helping them to make sure that, helping them to create the right kinds of policies and regulations that will be further support youth and families in those communities that are being talked about in the report.
Okay, so speaking of communities talked about in the report, Latinos seem to be faring the worst. Why is that?
You know, that's a tough question. Going back to those poverty statistics, which I think really drives a lot of the indicators that we talk about. You mentioned close to 40% of Latino children lived in poverty in 2013, which is the most recent data that we have. That equates to about 250,000 Latino children, so 250,000 living in poverty, and that's actually about half of all poor children in New York City. I would also add that we know that a lot of those kids live in the same communities that are facing very high poverty rates. So you're not just talking about individual or family poverty, but you're talking about communities who have very scarce resources. I think in addition to that, you could talk about some cultural issues, for instance, and maybe Yolanda could speak more to this, but we have a measure that we call linguistic isolation, which refers to The share of children,
Right.
yeah, exactly, you're on the right page. Share of children under the age of 14 who live in households where no one over the age of 13 speaks English well or very well. And citywide, that statistic is about 16%, but we know in some communities like Sunset Park here in Brooklyn, it's up to about 40%. So you can imagine how difficult it might be for one of those families to access the services and supports that they may need.
So this is a snapshot of right now, but do we have a sort of historical lens to look at this to see what maybe the parents of these young people, what situations they were,
Right.
and then to take it a step further with measures like universal pre-K or other initiatives that have been undertaken by the administration to see what impact that they have, or is now the baseline and we'll look moving forward?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to sort of the historical
Okay,
trends.
please.
We've been producing this book since 1993, so for over 20 years. And in the past 2 decades, we've certainly seen a lot of changes in the city.
For the better or for the worse? Are we sliding or
So
getting closer?
it depends. So citywide, we're seeing a lot of improvement. So in
Yeah.
health measures, we've seen over the past 2 decades, the infant mortality rate's been cut in half.
Right.
Graduation rates have improved dramatically. I think in the early 90s, only about 40% of public high school students were graduating on time. We now are looking at about 64%.
Okay.
In other areas, like economic indicators, we're not looking so good. You know, the most recent recession really erased a lot of the gains that we saw in the mid-2000s. And actually that 30% child poverty rate, I went back and looked at our first book. Guess what the child poverty rate was in 1991? 30%. So, yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, again, layperson speaking here, when you see things that are just linked to well-being improve, like healthcare, I kind of feel like universal pre-K may have some kind of balancing effect, especially for those who are in linguistically isolated situations. What do you think?
No, absolutely. I think for us, we actually operate a lot of pre-K programs. We actually provide early childhood programs that serve children and families from 0 through 5 years of age. And so it is very important for us to make sure that we have staff in our pre-K programs that can speak the language. And so particularly in our programs, we have staff in the classrooms who actually speak Spanish. And that is extremely helpful because a lot of our programs are in communities, particularly like in Washington Heights and South Bronx, where there are a lot of immigrant families, and they don't necessarily, the children come in not necessarily speaking speaking English. And so we want to make sure that we can communicate with the families and communicate with the children, and also help them transition in terms of their learning English.
So I know the Children's Aid Society has more money than God. You guys don't need any funding or anything. But is this something, like, to be serious, is this something that we can buy our way out of? Like, we talk about housing, and it's like, you can't legislate your way out of the housing crisis, you have to build, or can you build your way? But is this something that really, if we backed up the Brinks truck, we could see these numbers just go down in the right ways, or is there larger systemic things that need to happen besides just moolah?
Well, I think money is absolutely helpful in this situation, but I think we also need to think about it in terms of there's just not one need that children and families are experiencing. They're experiencing a multitude of needs, and so if they are hungry, they're not only hungry, but their families may be experiencing.
It's not happening in a vacuum.
It's not happening in a vacuum. They may need health care that they're not getting, or they may not actually have a stable housing situation, or they may need food. And so we look at it from a very comprehensive situation. So I think it's very important in terms of looking at it in that way to address those needs. I think what the administration is doing in terms of focusing on community schools and ensuring that the services are connected and comprehensive is the right way to go.
Yeah, I would add to that, you know, this stuff is going to take money and resources, but it's also going to take political buy-in from the community. And we need to make sure that people realize that solutions that help children and families are going to help all of New Yorkers.
Absolutely.
Right. There's a bigger picture, and I think that it's easy for people to kind of not see how it all connects, because this is generational. So we go back, I forgot what year you said, it was 93, it was 30%. Now it's a little more than 30%. So what is it going to be 10 years from now? And in order to impact those numbers, as a community, completely New York City is going to have to kind of buy into it. But this isn't directly linked to the report, but you mentioned that 24,000 school children spent the night in homeless shelters. Now, Mayor de Blasio came out yesterday, was it yesterday, Brian? Yesterday, and he said it was $100 million will be dedicated to homeless shelters. Is that, I don't know if that's transitioning people out or what that is, but how, is this the kind of policy and this kind of political support that you guys are looking for?
Well, I think it actually is very helpful to the provider community in terms of having additional resources. I think there are a lot of needs that are showing up in our school system, particularly children that are living in homeless shelters. And so I think anything that supports what's going on in homeless shelters will support what's going on in schools and actually create more stable environments for children.
Yeah, and back to what Yolanda said about taking sort of the holistic look. You know, that money is going to go not just to the shelters, but preventive measures and aftercare, transitioning families after, you know, after they leave shelters, because there are a lot of services centered in homeless shelters. You know, homeless shelters aren't great places to be, but they're places where you can access services. So when families transition out of those shelters, we need to make sure they're still able to access those services.
So on the same train of thought, who are your allies in this? If we have a mayor who's focusing resources and, frankly, attention on these problems, so we have a person who's in a position of power, who else, what committee of the willing is there moving forward? And inversely, is anyone benefiting from these numbers being so abysmal? Like, not to be all conspiracy theory, but like, is there, if our numbers are this low and we're in the richest city in America, presumably in a lot of ways, is someone okay by keeping these numbers where they are?
No, I think it's just a matter of getting the resources. You know, we're in what we call the budget dance right now, so it's a matter of making sure that the resources are directed to the places that they need to be directed. In terms of who we're working with, you know, groups like Yolanda's, other direct service providers, other advocates out there, faith-based leaders. We obviously work with the administration and the city agencies constantly, elected officials. You know, we all share the same sort of shared goals. It's just a matter of A, resources, and B, implementation, I think.
So when you say implementation, where would you say like the top 2 or 3 places are resources needed? Because you hear resources, I hear they're needed, but where? And what's going to make the biggest impact immediately?
Well, I would say for us, it's definitely schools. I mean, we look at education as a great equalizer in terms of moving children out of poverty. And so having resources actually centralized into schools is extremely important, and also it supports children in settings where they're there for most of the school day or most of the day. And so that is, for us, the #1 location where we think services are helpful to be centralized. Absolutely.
One of our big priorities is, or one of the things that we are constantly advocating for, is services based in schools, particularly health and mental health. Because we know that there's a huge need for mental health services, and there can be a stigma surrounding that. So if you're in an environment that is comfortable, you're already there, it's community-based, to be able to destigmatize some of those issues is really helpful. So schools, and then I would add to schools sort of the very early 0 to 3, 0 to 5 education, and also the after school.
So are we treating this, and we're closing, but are we treating this as a public health issue? Because it seems like Tati asked the sort of triage question. If someone comes into the hospital and they have a gunshot wound, you don't start off with a hangnail. So we'll start with schools, but is it being looked at in that public health sense? Like, we got to get people on it.
I think more and more the issue of poverty is looked at as a public health issue, just the way you know, gun violence is looked at as a public health issue rather than just a trauma or critical health issue. Yeah, so I think we are definitely talking to the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene about poverty instead of just about birth outcomes and other things like that. So yeah, I guess again, I'm going back to that sort of holistic approach.
It has to be, Yolanda, just some last words from you, please.
No, I totally agree, and I think that's why mental health services are very important, because the effects of poverty create a sense of trauma in a lot of the children and families that we're serving, and so we really try to provide mental health services to ensure that those barriers are removed, and so the children can be healthier and can be in schools, and also that the families can move forward and to make sure that there are healthy, loving, and stable environments.
Awesome. Let's keep this in everyone's minds. It's election
Absolutely.
season.
That's
the presidential candidates should be talking about this.
Thank you so much to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.